So I'm now going to welcome the chair of our first education programme, Sarah Brown. She is the chair of Theirworld and she's the executive chair of Global Business Coalition for Education. She's always been a passionate advocate for global education and health issues. She covers the whole world of business, philanthropy, social media, and charity campaigning. She's also somebody who warmly and lovingly makes sure that all her work and conversations are truly inclusive. And so, Sarah, I'm really pleased that you've joined us for Wow Global. Thank you so much. I'm handing over to you now.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jude. And it's just a complete joy to be here, knowing that we're connecting with so many other women around the world for Wow 24. And it's a unique experience that I know you're being quite pioneering here. So congrats to the Wow team. Now, I'm really, really pleased that education is front and centre of the discussion today. And we know that it's the one investment that you can make in girls that can transform their futures. Our panel here come from all kinds of backgrounds: economics, health, human rights, youth engagement and skills. So I'm going to introduce them here to you. So as I say their name, they will explain to you what they do. So let's start with Nkosi Ongonjo-Iweala.
Thank you, Sarah. I'm the chair of Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, and former finance minister of Nigeria.
And also we're joined by Yasmin Sharif.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. My name is Yasmin Sharif, and I am the Director of Education Cannot Wait, a global fund.
And Jamira Burley.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. It is truly a pleasure. I am the Head of Youth Engagement and Skills at the Global Business Coalition for Education.
Now, we know that we want so much investment into education to be able to unlock the future of girls around the world, but the pandemic has had an enormous impact, with 1.5 billion children having their schooling disrupted during this time. Can I start with you, Ngozi, as not just as the chair of Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, but also with a huge role at the World Health Organization in coordinating the financing around the pandemic? What's that impact on girls that's going to allow them to be ready and engaged and able to take up their schooling?
Well, thank you, Sarah. Let me just start first by saying what the impact of this pandemic has been on girls. I heard Jude saying something about she hopes that this will not hold girls and women back. And we're sincerely hoping that, because as a result of the pandemic, there's lots of campaigns, immunization campaigns that have been missed. We were expecting about, from Gavi, 68 introductions, and I'm talking now of your regular routine immunization campaigns. Out of 68 introductions we expected this year, 48 have already either been missed or are in danger of being postponed. And this means that millions of children, in fact, we estimate 13.5 million children, may not get their immunization, their vaccinations. And this will lead to other, infectious diseases like measles, diphtheria, polio, and so on, perhaps reoccurring. And of course, millions of these children are girls. You also have to think of the HPV vaccine for adolescent girls. Some of them get it through the school site. So by being out of school, some of them also miss out on this. So there's a huge impact on the health side, and by getting back to school, getting back to a normal situation, we hope that these vaccinations and immunization routines will be restored. Let me just mention one second thing. I have an economics background, so I can't. Very, very important on the impact on education is also the economic impact of COVID. Millions of households have been thrown into poverty, and there's an estimate actually that 40 to 60 million more people may slide back into poverty as a result of COVID. Now, what happens when a household is pulled back into poverty? Girls bear the brunt of this because they're held back to help the family to be able to cope, whether it's coping with helping with livelihood or livelihoods, restoring livelihoods, or looking after their siblings. So the economic impact of this is also very, very important, and we need to pay attention to it, because it also holds girls back.
So we're seeing that impact on girls economically very, very quickly. Now, Yasmin, you're leading Education Cannot Wait, which provides a humanitarian response to deliver education for girls and boys, but who are caught in conflict and humanitarian crises. How acute is the problem there for the disruption of schooling and education for children in crisis?
Well, it's very acute, and to quote Martin Luther King when he once said, "It is about taking action with an intense." I can't even remember the quote, but the intense urgency with which we take action and not just talking. COVID-19 has thrown out 75 million children that were already in crisis and had difficulties to access quality education. All the 75 million children and youth, of whom 39 million are girls and adolescent girls, are now out of school, and they are suffering and in several ways. First of all, in most of these crisis countries, and I speak about Afghanistan, I speak about countries in the Middle East, in sub-Saharan Africa, and refugee girls, they are already discriminated because of their gender. So that discrimination was there, and they are already disempowered because of the gender. And then on top of it, they are already in a crisis or in a situation of refuge, uprooted from their home, or witnessing or being subjected to violence because of a conflict. And now on top of it, there is COVID-19, throwing them out of schools, which is the very last hope for ending discrimination against them and their gender and as women through an education, and also the only way out of abject poverty. So what we see, because of there's an economic recession, they cannot go to school, they don't work. First of all, we expect that millions of girls will not return to school, even when school and education resumes, because the longer you are away from school and there's disruption, the more likely you will never return. Two, because of the economic recession, they will have to become the breadwinners of their families. So they have to find ways of working now. And that can also be through prostitution. Girls will be sold as child brides in order for the family to get money. They have to do either they will be subjected to domestic or sexual violence as a result of economic recession and abject poverty, where everyone is in despair, and they will take it out on the girls. So it's a massive, massive impact on 39 million girls in conflict and crisis countries who were already before COVID-19 in an extremely vulnerable and threatening situation.
Thanks. If I can turn to you, Jamira, Ngozi and Yasmin both paint a very stark picture for the health, well-being, education and future of young girls. You're very focused, directly working with youth, engagement with them, looking at how they build skills, particularly in urban environments. If we stay on the problems for a moment and start to move to the solutions, where do you see the most kind of the greatest barriers for girls that are holding them back, and young women, for how they can access education and build on the skills they need for the future?
No, that's a very good question. And thanks again for having me. I wish in this moment I could be much more positive, but I think, as laid by Ngozi and Yasmin, is that this is the perfect storm of a lot of different both war, famine, poverty, and in many cases, civil uprising in regards to racial injustices around the world, including here in the US. And I think one of the things we're struggling with is how to redefine what safety and community looks like for many cities across the country and the world by reinvesting dollars that would traditionally go to enforcement, military, to the communities, including education. We've talked about this before, that education oftentimes is an equalizer, but also an opportunity step for young people to be able to transform their communities. And that has to be in the backdrop of the fourth industrial revolution, where robotics, automation will transform the workforce for the future. And our goal at GBC Education is to really harness the voices, the experiences, of the lived experiences of young people to contextualize what we know to be true around the skills for the future. And last year, we introduced our skills report, which looked at what were the skills needed for the fourth industrial revolution. And many of them centered around leadership development, entrepreneurships, which I think oftentimes are skills not honed in young girls. And so we recognize that when you hone those skills, when you educate young girls around the world, they actually transform their own individual lives, but also the lives of their community overall. And so I do think that this moment is extremely important because it will set the stage for an entire generation of young girls in education. But in the positive note, I do think in this moment of coronavirus, in this moment of poverty, in this moment of famine, as well as racial uprising, that it has awakened the consciousness of so many people who now understand the systematic changes that need to happen in order to create pathways for young girls to get access to quality education.
Thank you. So I'm going to turn back around to Ngozi as we keep the conversation. We've just entered into a slightly more positive note where we can see opportunities to build and change. We have huge challenges, there's no question, even before the pandemic. You know, being able to reach girls, to give them the chance of education when they're caught either in poverty or in a humanitarian crisis was a great challenge. And arguing and making the case for global funding has always been a tough one. Ngozi, do you see that kind of coexistence of the investment in health and the investment in education as drawing a little closer together? Every country has a separate department for these two things, separate ministers, separate engagement. And the poor finance minister is always pulled in both directions, you know, as you all know from direct experience in Nigeria. What can we do as we build forward with the global financing and the you know, maybe the systemic change needs to start right up there at that top level. What chance is there for being able to change things now?
Well, you know, Sarah, Winston Churchill said, never waste a crisis. And I think we should look at this crisis because there's many opportunities that are coming up. We can't work in silos anymore. You know, this is health, this is education. What this has shown us is how interconnected everything is. This crisis has shown us our interconnectedness. It's also shown us our vulnerability. And so all this means that in this world, you know, you cannot act alone, you cannot exist alone. And for our girls, we should be thinking in terms of solidarity, connectedness. And then, you know, this leads to how do you get the resources, you know, to be able to focus on giving these girls the opportunity that they need. I think that this crisis has, you know, opened up eyes, you know, to new ways of viewing, new ways of looking at the issues that we've always had and which have been exacerbated by this crisis. So I think that people will look and see what has happened to education. Actually, Sarah, let me say something for education. This crisis has shown that online education can happen if you can connect communities. You know, girls who are prevented from going to school ordinarily, either because their families are poor or there are some cultural issues that hold them back. If we could invest in either laying the infrastructure, satellite or broadband, these children could be educated even at home because they've seen how online education has exploded during this crisis. But so I would like to see a situation in which resources and financing are being focused on some of these new issues and new ways of viewing things so that girls can have the opportunity in future that they may have missed out on. So I'm all with you. You know, as a former finance minister, we have seen that health and education. Then let me paint a large picture on health. You have to steer resources to health because without health, we've seen it now, you don't have an economy. Because of this pandemic, look at how the trillions and trillions of dollars that are being spent all over the world, particularly in the rich countries, to bring the economies back. If we had invested billions in health, we would not have to spend trillions now. What we are saying for the future, I'm working on the vaccines issue, as you said. Let's invest the necessary billions now in COVID. We're estimating we need about $33 billion. Let's invest it now to avoid us spending trillions in future. So I'm very much of that mind of redirecting resources now to health and education.
Well, it's been interesting to see the world leaders find the resources when they've needed to, whereas in the past we hear them say they don't have it. Now, before I move on to Yasmin Ngozi, I can't let a conversation with you pass without noting that you have a book out this week that's very specifically about women's leadership. What's the difference you think that women's leadership makes and can make in a crisis like this? And thinking of education specifically.
Well, I'm quite proud of although I don't think we talk enough about what women are doing and their leadership in this crisis. But we know that a few of our women leaders, from Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand to Angela Merkel to Anna Solberg, and let me just take it down. We have women leaders on my continent in Africa who are also doing so many things. Grasa Machel has been trying to bring attention to girls' education and the issue of women during this crisis so we don't slide back. So women are showing an extraordinary talent. They empathize, they can be strong and they can be soft. They are strong to make decisions quickly about lockdowns and to convince their population on the things they need to do. They are soft to empathize with what is going on in families and for people to see that they care. They've built trust, and all of these qualities allow them to be very good leaders during this crisis. So I'm very proud of what women are doing, and I think we should highlight it more. Thank you for talking about the book. It's about women's leadership, and some of these people, like Jacinda I mentioned, are in the book. We have Ellen Johnson Sirleaf in the book, Joyce Banda, Theresa May. We are trying to look at these women and say, what are their life experiences? And what can we learn from their leadership styles that can inform us and inform our girls and young women for the future?
Thank you. Well, I consider as part of your book launch efforts this week. Yasmin, Ngozi talked about technology and bringing technology into the home as a way to open up access to education. Is that an opportunity as we emerge from this crisis for families, for girls who are caught up in crisis in refugee camps or on the move, or even girls who are at risk where child marriage is a prospect that's looming for them? You talked about, other dangers for them. Can we harness technology to keep them safer by keeping them learning?
Thank you, Sarah. Absolutely. And I can see, the work that we have done, Education Cannot Wait, and Theirworld on the Greek islands, where we have refugees who have fled from, I think, over 50 different nationalities hosted on these islands in reception centers. Thanks to the infrastructure, the investments made together has allowed for WhatsApp and shortwave radios to be used to maintain their education during the social distancing. So definitely that is an option. But I do want to look at, is that an option everywhere? No, because we live in a world where social inequity and socioeconomic inequity needs to be fixed once and for all. And especially in the education sector. You go to Central African Republic, you won't be able to have the infrastructure to do technology to maintain learning in the new way of doing it, or in Afghanistan or South Sudan. So I think that there are new innovative ways that can bring about the change. Because when we had the Second World War and we had the Holocaust, then there was a huge sort of revolution that came out of that created the United Nations and said never again. And today, COVID-19, with all its economic recession and the implications, and then we have Black Lives Matter. People are tired. They're tired of injustices. They're tired of social inequities. Enough is enough. And now I'm going to get the quote right, but Alice Walker who wrote Color Purple, she said, we are the ones that we've been waiting for. So we now have to use this opportunity. In the education world, I see some really revolutionary ways of changing inequity for education and making sure that every child gets access to education, including half of them as 50% girls. We have education cannot wait, that moves with speed in crisis. That for us, it doesn't matter what crisis, we just have to be there to maintain and sustain and protect girls. Then there is and we are doing this in over 30 countries right now, and probably one of the most unprecedented fastest responses in a crisis. Then we have the international finance facility, which is an innovative finance mechanism that can unlock $10 billion to make sure that every child, of whom 50% are girls in the world, can access a quality education through a system that is moving towards socioeconomic equity rather than being the one begging and never being and stitching the garments of something that is torn apart, rather laying the foundation and ending extreme poverty. So I think if we look into the different finance mechanisms that exist and the great work that UN agencies are doing, Global Partnership for Education, UNICEF, UNHR, UNESCO, and come together, but also keep looking at the Black Lives Matter movement. Look at the inability to manage COVID-19 through technology in big parts of Africa. Why? Because of social injustice, because of past histories. This is the moment for change and be the ones that we were looking for, as Alice Walker said.
Thank you. Jamira, when Yasmin's talking, she's talking about big change. She's talking about governments having to make difference. Ngozi talks about the big financing investment in infrastructure so we can bring, internet and access to online education to every child. All of us can feel quite powerless as to know how to make that change happen. You're directly engaged with campaigning, with activism. It's been your lifelong passion. I know you're there right in Harlem, active every single day in some part with the Black Lives Matter movement, and not just in recent months, going back a long time. How do you see firsthand the difference that an individual young person can make when they want to use their voice, they want to march, they want to join a petition? What difference does that make to these big changes that we need so that there is fairness and there is opportunity for young people to go to school, to learn, to be healthy, to thrive?
Yeah, since a lot of quotes were offered up, I feel like I should start with one. Audre Lorde once said that if you are silent about your pain, they will kill you and say you enjoyed it. And I think what this moment is really reflective is that young people, poor people, people who have been pushed to the margins for so long are no longer going to be silent about their pain. Because with coronavirus, with COVID-19, I should say, with civil uprise, with war, with famine, with Black Lives Matter movement is demonstrating is that there is the vast majority of people in this world are pushed to the margins and don't have access to quality education, don't have access to pathways for economic justice in this country or racial justice within this country and around this world. And what I see with many of the young people who for the first time ever in their lives are taking up arms, are marching, are creating pathways to use their voices to transform, to create real transformative change is that young people are no longer asking for permission, right? They're no longer waiting for someone to give them a leadership role in order for them to start taking action because they see firsthand the injustices that are happening in their communities. And I think what Ngozi alluded to is the need for collective change, right? Is the need to bring all unlikely suspects to the table to create solutions that are keeping in mind the experiences of everyone, especially centering those of young people. And so we're looking with the launch of the Skills Friendly City Initiative as an opportunity to ask mayors to work in collaboration with business leaders, in collaboration with young people and other community organizations to think comprehensively, what do local solutions look like for jobs and economic development, for education for those who are the most marginalized. But I think it really requires a cultural shift to see young people as equal partners in this development and not just as tokenized experiences that we can bring in moments of entertainment or moments of empathy. And I think that's really what young people are asking for is a seat, not just a seat at the table to design what the room looks like in order for them to get closer to the dreams that they have for themselves.
Well, you and I have had an arrangement over some years where I try to make space for you. And so when I'm invited to a high level table, you take the seat. But I'm hoping that during the kind of, as we come out of this time with businesses, organizations looking for how that they can do better and build back better, as they say, that rather than you occupying my seat, that seat becomes your seat. And I think we haven't yet reached that moment. And it's a shift that we need to work together to try and achieve, but knocking on quite a lot of doors to make that happen. But I feel cautiously optimistic that now's a moment where organizations and businesses are looking to change and might make that switch at this time. You work a lot with businesses and talking to them. The Skills Friendly Cities Initiative is one where if mayors and political leaders engage with it, you also are looking for those organizations to open their doors. What's the role that business can play? Because many young people have jobs there, they're part of it, they're looking for their employers to not just talk about how they want to do better, but actually see that systemic shift, really.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think prior to what's happening in recent months is that a lot of corporations would make very flowery statements to the public, but internally they weren't reflecting those same values they were projecting to the outside world. And what we're now seeing is a shift where those organizations are being called out. What we know about young people, especially the millennial and Gen Z generation, is that they want to work, they want to interact with companies that actually have values that are similar to theirs, values that respect human rights, that respect opportunities for young people. And I think what corporations need to understand is that it's no longer a cute thing to care about education or a cute thing to care about youth development. It actually is going to impact their bottom line long term. And so it's really a smart investment to think about how they can be collaborative partners now. And that's not just about writing big checks. It's also about helping to work in collaboration to think about what curriculum should look like for the jobs for the future. It's also about providing technical assistance and technology when available, or creating pathways for broadband internet in communities of color. And so there are many different avenues that businesses can step outside themselves that requires more engagement beyond just writing a small check, a one-time grant to an organization if it's not going to create the sustainable change that we need for this generation and future generations to come.
And do you think that voice up from young people, what's the individual action that you can take that makes a difference? Is it about opening up and sharing what you think, or being part of the formal systems in an organization? What makes the difference? If you're
I think it all makes a difference. I think it all makes a difference because we need youth voices in every single industry and every single aspect of our government and every single place and space in which traditionally we're not open to young people. So yes, we need young people on the engineering floor. Yes, we need young people in the negotiation spaces talking about peace. Yes, we need young people getting the jobs or getting access to leadership roles to be able to not just talk about their experience, but help to ideation in the ideation portion of what the solutions look like, as well as the implementation. So I think for companies, for organizations that are thinking about engaging young people, it's really thinking about how do you create space for those who you're trying to serve to actually being the actors to design the solutions that they need for themselves. And if that means paying young people, if that means giving up a leadership role, if that means holding yourself accountable, all of those things are required if we're really trying to be honest about the importance of youth voices in this space.
Great. So I know we're coming up to, as we count down to the end of our session, I'm going to come round to each of you. And what I want to know is what's the one thing that you would change, that you think would bring change to the lives of the women and girls that we seek to serve and to give a better life. Ngozi, put you in the hot spot for the one thing.
Sarah, there are going to be two things. The first one,
of course there are.
The first one is what I would wish is that when a woman or a girl walks into the room, you listen and see their intellect and not their gender or their color. See beyond all that to who they are. If we could do that, it would really change the lives of women and girls. It would change the injustice that we see, the marginalization that we see. We don't want to see Black Lives Matter again, marching 10, 15 years from now. And I want people to see who girls and women are beyond their gender and their color. And this will help us move.
And what's the number two thing?
Number
What's
two
the
thing
second?
is second one is very practical, and I'll be very fast. There is a killer of women, that is cervical cancer, that kills over 200,000 women. What I wish is HPV vaccine for all adolescent girls, because this
Well,
will
the most
prevent them from
straightforward way
dying.
is to administer it at school. It's the easiest
Yeah,
way. Yeah.
absolutely. So you see, I go from the broad to the particular.
Thank you. Yasmin, what's your one thing to change
Well,
change
now
lives
I'm
for
so
girls?
inspired, and I have also two things, and the two things I have is similar to your two things. Because I have got inspired from this. We have to stop defining human beings based on gender, ethnicity, color of the skin. You define them as a soul, as a spiritual being with a mind and a heart and a soul. All these gender definitions are so wrong. They're so wrong even to define who is homosexual, who is bisexual, who is a man, who is a woman, who is to define who. I mean, we are souls. So that's number one. And it applies especially for those who are discriminated on the basis of their gender. And secondly, so there I fully agree with you. And secondly, to be very concrete, we need education, but not any education. It has to be an education that empower women and give them the self-confidence to stand up and take part in an opposition against discrimination, to get the education that they need to thrive and survive and become women leaders. If it's going to be an education where you're hammering data into their head, and not an education that allows them to recognize who we are as powerful beings that can take them further to become leaders, then that education is not worth much. So modernize education, empower them, the social emotional development, and the internal empowerment. This is who I am. I'm a soul, and I'm out there to change the world. Forget about if I'm the color of my skin or whether I'm a man or a woman. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Jamira, your one or two things quickly.
I'm going to stick with one, but I appreciate all of those sentiments that's come before me. What I will say is that, I'm approaching 32, so my sisters will say that I'm old. But I'm in this space because a lot of that is because my community wrapped their arms around me. I come directly from experiencing poverty and violence in my community. And now I'm in a position where I'm able to influence folks on how they invest in education. And I think what I would change is that I would help people to understand that we need to value young people and see youth potential as all of our responsibility and wrap our arms around it. We can't see those young people as that community's responsibility. We all have to take an active role to ensure that regardless of where a young person is born, their gender, their sexual orientation, their race, that they're all of our responsibility, and we all have a role to play to ensure that they are whole, healthy, educated, to enable them to reach their full potential in our society.
Thank you. And I think in Pride Week, it's important to have reached out to be fully inclusive with who we're talking about. Covering education, I think what's been clear in our conversation is how important it is that education is at the centre, and it's the one investment that we can make in girls and women that will unlock their own future, impact on their communities, impact on their economies, but also has such a close association with their rights, with their personal empowerment, with their health and their well-being. Theirworld has been really, really delighted to be able to work with WOW. We've been long-time friends, partners, collaborators from the very start of the WOW festivals, that when Jude first set them up, and with her growing an extraordinary team of women around the world. It's a delight to be part of this, kicking off this first education section. We've talked about some very big, overwhelming issues of how you can unlock education where it feels very unwieldy and in the hands of the leaders of the world. But there are ways that you can act, and there are ways where you can add your voice. And I would encourage all of you to log on to theirworld.org and sign up for the free newsletter there with your email. And we will just send you once a week stories about amazing things that girls, women, young people are doing around the world, but also actions you can take, where you can sign up, where you can just ping in your email, and we'll send you ways where you can take an action. Your tweets, your posts, your Facebook messaging going out makes the most extraordinary difference. And I think all of us have worked and been in rooms where we've seen political leaders take a decision and they're influenced wholeheartedly by the messages that they get. And when we collect together all those petitions and signatures, you may not think it makes a difference, but my goodness me, if you're the politician in the room, I think Ngozi would echo that there are times when you've been on the receiving end of petitions coming at you where you go, I hear people, I hear their voices, and I know that I can make that difference. So we've been delighted to be part of this session, talking to you today about education, about the opportunities for girls, about the unfairness and inequity there, that through no fault of their own. And I know that in the sessions here in the rest of today, you'll be listening to sessions around justice, sessions around health, sessions around violence, that I would urge you to hear the kind of drumbeat that we've started with, to say that education really can stand in the way of child labour for girls, stand in the way of preventing child marriage, of ending FGM, of contributing to keeping girls safer, but also, more powerfully, giving them the opportunity to learn, giving, as Yasmin said, not just to learn some of the basic technical things, but also to be able to learn properly as a human being, make a contribution to the world, and know that that contribution is valid. So thank you for engaging and listening to this session.